So I thought I would make a video laying out in fairly simple terms the case for God, for thinking that God exists. The way I'm defining God is as a perfect being, a being that's unlimited in knowledge, power, and goodness. And this is the classical conception that most theists adopt. So let's get into the case. The first thing to note is that it makes sense to believe in something if it's very parsimonious, it doesn't add a lot to your theory, and it explains a lot of things about the world. It makes sense to, for example, believe in Julius Caesar, that he existed, because his existence explains lots of historical evidence, and it's not the type of thing that's very intrinsically improbable. We know people exist, it's not that improbable that one of them would be like Caesar, and it explains a lot about the world. So you should believe a hypothesis when it's intrinsically probable, meaning that it's probable even before you look at the evidence, and it explains a lot of data. It explains a lot about the world. So then the question is theism like that? Is God the type of being that is simple, that has a high prior probability, that's probable before that we look at the evidence? And is God also the type of being that explains a lot about the world? And my claim is that God meets both these criteria. So let's look first to the claim that God has a high prior probability, that God is probable before we look at the evidence. Normally, when calculating prior probability, there are different ways of doing it, but usually people will think that one important factor is simplicity, and another important factor is lacking arbitrary limits. So, for example, if one theory says there are a bunch of different things and there's no unifying feature behind them, and the other theory says that there's just one very simple thing, the simpler theory wins out. And similarly, if one theory says that there's an arbitrary limit, that theory is worse than the theory that says there isn't. The theory that, for example, there's no speed of light, we should have believed that before discovering that there was a speed of light. The theory that space is infinite in size is better than the theory that that the universe is exactly 8 quadrillion kilometers across. You should not think there's a limit unless you're given a reason to think that there's a limit. So now I claim that theism does really well on both these criteria. Let's think about what theism is fundamentally. I think really at a fundamental level, it's the hypothesis that there's an unlimited mind. Now, if a mind doesn't know something, that's a limit on the mind. If the mind can't do something, that's a limit on the mind. So if there's an unlimited mind, then that mind would be the sort of thing that would know all things and be able to do all things. So you might wonder, well, why would it be good? I think it would be good, and this is for the following reason. And note, this reason is endorsed by many philosophers. Many philosophers accept this thesis. I think that if you recognize that something is good, that something is worth pursuing, if you don't have some aberrant psychology, if you don't have some, compulsion in the opposite direction, you'll be somewhat motivated to do that thing. If, for example, you come to see that it's a good idea to exercise, you might not exercise because there's some other thing that compels you not to. But if you recognize that there's something desirable about exercising, and you're perfectly rational, as it would be the case of an infinite mind, of an unlimited mind, then you would be compelled to exercise. And so if God comes to recognize all the things that are good, and comes to understand at a deep level that he ought to do it, and he has no extra limits, so there's no extra psychological inhibition, then God would be motivated to bring about every good thing. So God would have perfectly moral motivations. He wouldn't fail to act in accordance with the good. He would instead act in accordance with the good. No, I'm saying obviously God, doesn't have a sex, but God is just this unlimited mind. So if you have an unlimited mind, I claim this would be omnipotent, it would be omniscient, and it would be omnibenevolent. It would recognize that it's good to do the right thing, and it would be motivated to do that. You don't have to construe it exactly as a mind. Maybe you think that the right way of thinking about this is God is just an unlimited agent. Agents have power and knowledge and agency. And so God has unlimited power, unlimited knowledge, and because he has unlimited knowledge, he realizes that he ought to do the right thing. And you might think, look, even if you know the right thing, maybe there was no fact of the matter about what's objectively good, and maybe even if there is a fact of the matter, that's sort of the kind of thing constructed by humans. I'll just say, I'm very doubtful of these theses, and I don't think you should be super confident in these theses. Normally what it makes sense to do is, rather than starting with our philosophical assumptions and then using them to inform the evidence, we should use philosophy to generate the available hypotheses, and then we should look at what best explains the evidence. So, prior to Einstein, a lot of people said, look, you can't have Einstein's theory because it says that time bends. But time clearly doesn't bend, and so his theory is ridiculous. Now, I think that the idea philosophically that time can bend, that's much weirder than the idea that things are good, and if a thing is good, then it's the type of thing that a perfect being, that a being that's perfectly rational would care about. I think the idea that time could bend is much weirder. So I think that you should not start out certain of this, of course, but you should think this is at least a live option on the table. You shouldn't be super confident that it's false before you look at what best explains the world. And I'm going to claim that I think theism, if you say that an unlimited mind would do these things and would be perfectly good, you get a very good explanation of many of the features of the world. So that's my first claim. Okay, so this is what theism is fundamentally. Now we come to the question, okay, how simple is theism? I think the answer is theism is really, really simple. It's a really simple hypothesis, because it just posits that there's one fundamental thing. This fundamental thing is not composed of parts. There aren't like a bunch of different minds that combine together to form the single mind. It's a single mind with no limits, and it's just one thing. Positing one thing is the best hypothesis that you could think. If you, like me, think that minds are fundamental, and if I remember to, I'll link in the description to an article where I argue that minds are fundamental. And even if you don't remember the analysis I gave earlier about how, even if you think maybe they're fundamental, maybe they're not, you should just see whether the theory that there's a fundamental mind explains the data well. And if so, then you should conclude that there was a fundamental mind. If you think this, then you should think, okay, theism might have a high intrinsic probability because it's not proposing that there are any parts. It's just proposing there's one single fundamental thing. And in terms of arbitrary limits, this thing doesn't have any arbitrary limits. So while the naturalist hypothesis, well, they'll say that there are some fundamental forces and they have particular prescribed mathematical properties and spatial locations and so on, the theist says that there's just one single thing and it doesn't have any limits. So that's a much better theory in terms both of simplicity and in terms of not having arbitrary limits. Now, I want to just address one objection that's pretty common, where people will say, look, theism can't actually be simpler because it posits one more thing. I think this is the wrong way to think about simplicity. Simplicity is about the things that you believe in that aren't explained by other stuff. So it's not a simple theory to think only my consciousness exists and say, look, I believe in fewer things. You think the world and everyone else's consciousness exists. I just think my consciousness exists. That's not actually simpler, because then you're positing that your consciousness is fundamental, that nothing else explains it. And your consciousness is very complicated and it's composite, and you have all these different experiences, and you're proposing that all of that has no deeper explanation. That's a very bad theory. It's not at all parsimonious. It's very complicated. So I think that you should think that simplicity is about the fundamental things. Theism posits just one fundamental thing that gives rise to everything else. Similarly, it wouldn't be a good theory to say, look, I believe that when things go out of it wouldn't be a good theory to say that, for example, on parsimony grounds, you should think there's not very much stuff in the world. You should think probably the universe isn't that big. Because if the universe is big, but that's explained by fundamental laws, that would still be parsimonious. So I think that God is parsimonious for the same reason that a big universe that emerges from simple fundamental laws would be parsimonious. Now, let me make one final point about the high prior probability of theism. And this is the following. What you should look for in a theory is not just the theory that is simpler on average, but the theory that has the best claim to being the simplest theory. Every extra arbitrary limit that you add, every extra bit of complexity, massively reduces the probability of the theory. So, for example, the theory that there's an unlimited mind is way better than the theory that there's an unlimited mind, except it just doesn't know one random fact. Like, it doesn't know the capital of Italy. That theory is way worse. It's infinitely worse. And if you don't think it's infinitely worse, then you have to think that the sum total of all those theories, where you say God doesn't know any particular fact, have a higher probability than the theory that there's just an unlimited mind. Similarly, the theory that the laws of nature simply break down in one location in space, that theory is way worse than the theory that the laws of nature are completely uniform, even though it's just introducing one extra arbitrary limit. So what you should look for isn't what's simplest on average, but because a bit of extra complexity massively reduces the probability, the vast majority of the prior probability space will be concentrated on what has the best claim to being the simplest theories. And even though it's controversial that theism's simple, if theism's simple, it's really, really simple, just one thing, just one fundamental thing without limits. And so for that reason, you should think that theism has a pretty good claim to being fundamental. And if I remember, I'll link to an article below where I describe this in more detail. Okay, we've finally gotten away from simplicity. Now let's see what theism explains. So we think that a theory is confirmed if there are things that are likelier if the theory is true than if it's false. So for example, if I get a bunch of royal flushes in poker, you should think that's evidence that I'm cheating, because the probability that I would get a bunch of royal flushes in poker is higher if I'm cheating than the probability that I'm not cheating. Okay, all the preliminary clearing out of the way, let's see some of the evidence for theism. Well, I think a first bit of evidence for theism is that there's a physical world at all. Now, it's not guaranteed if theism were true that there would be a physical world. Maybe there wouldn't be. But a physical world is the type of thing that theism might explain. It's not terribly unlikely that the best kinds of things would have bodies, would be made out of physical components, and so on. So it's kind of likely, conditional on theism, that there would be a physical world, that there would be stuff at all. Next, theism predicts once there's stuff, naturalism is fine with there just being stuff that sits there not doing anything. Now, theism predicts that once there's stuff, it's very likely that there would be laws to apply to the stuff. If the stuff just sits around doing nothing, then that doesn't produce anything of value. If the stuff just remains static, remains in a dormant, stillborn state, God has no use for that. And so for that reason, theism predicts that God would not just make a bit of stuff, he would make there be laws that apply to the stuff. Next, I think theism predicts not just that there would be laws of some sort, but specifically that the laws would apply to the stuff that exists. So for example, you might have a law that says all x's do something, but there aren't any x's. This will depend a little bit on how you think of laws. Maybe you think that laws just describe the capacities that things have, but it's not so. But then it's unlikely that the things that would exist would have the capacities to interact with other things that exist. Maybe all the things that exist are x's, and x's only have the power to interact with y's. And so the things in the universe just sit in a completely dormant, stillborn state. Next, even once you have these laws, and the laws happen to apply to the stuff that exists, probably you wouldn't get anything very interesting. Just think about writing a random computer program to have stuff move around. Would you get any interesting life? Would you get anything complex forming? No, almost certainly you would get nothing interesting. And this result has been quite, well borne out. If you look at our laws of physics, if you just delete one of them, nothing works, right? Our laws are balanced on this very narrow razor's edge, where and this is a general fact about complex systems. For most complex systems, if you just tweak them a little bit, they sort of, it all turns to chaos. Nothing ends up being a value. So for that reason, I think that the fact that there are interesting things is very strong evidence for theism. Almost certainly on atheism, you would get a very simple set of laws that just don't produce anything interesting. Maybe the stuff just not doing anything. Maybe the stuff, all the particles just moving in a circle or moving in a straight line and bouncing around. But in any case, you would be very unlikely to get any interesting structure. In fact, this was famously borne out by a fellow named John Conway, who is a famous mathematician. And what Conway did was he had cellular automata. So you place down little dots, and then they evolve according to some set of rules. And what Conway found is it's actually really freaking difficult to get cellular automata to evolve in interesting ways. Conway found that, he had to work really hard to find. He invented a thing called the game of life, where you place down dots, and they produce interesting things. But Conway had to work extraordinarily hard in order to figure out a way to get the initial dots to evolve in an interesting pattern. The vast majority of ways that cellular automata could be, they wouldn't produce anything interesting, and you have to work really hard. So I claim the most probable ways for the world to be would not produce anything interesting. The most probable ways would just be a boring universe, or maybe a universe of random chaos or something like that. Then even once you have laws that are capable of producing interesting stuff, I think that those laws are very, very unlikely to be finely tuned. So what we've observed is that we have, the constants that go into those laws. So what we've observed is that our constants are finely tuned. What does this mean? It means that if you tweak the strength of the values that go into the laws of physics, so for example, the strength of gravity, or the strength of the cosmological constant. Actually, the cosmological constant is a better example than gravity. If you tweak it by even a little bit, no interesting stuff would arise. If it were a little bit stronger, everything would blow apart after like a millisecond, and if it were a bit weaker, everything would collapse after a millisecond. So we happen to get laws that fall in this extremely narrow range where they happen to produce some stuff that's interesting. Now, if people are curious, you might wonder, okay, isn't this argument, disproved by a multiverse? I think the multiverse explanation, while it's the best one that I think you can give on naturalism, I don't think the multiverse explanation is ultimately plausible. I think it has various problems. I won't go into all of them, but I'll have an article linked below where I talk about the fine-tuning argument in more detail, and I give 6 objections to the multiverse that I think are strong. And to be clear, they're not general objections to the multiverse. I believe in the multiverse, but I believe in a theistic multiverse. I think that on atheism, you wouldn't expect to get a multiverse. Okay, so now we've said, look, you wouldn't expect on atheism interesting things. You wouldn't expect, even if you have laws that would make interesting things, you wouldn't expect finely tuned constants. I think all this is right. A last point is just, and this is a bit more basic. you wouldn't expect stuff that interacts. There are a lot of conditions that have to go right for things to interact. So, for example, everything could be super far away, and then no stuff would interact. Or stuff could just be incapable of binding together to form more complex structures. Or there could just not be any time, and so there's no time over which a system evolves. All these are quite likely scenarios, and so it's very unlikely that we would happen to get all these things. Okay, so all these things are improbable. Then, I think theism, and I'm not going to go through all the evidence, so I have an article that I'll link below that goes through it in more detail. But I think theism explains several more key facts. One of those key facts is consciousness exists. We know that consciousness exists, we experience it directly. I think this is really surprising on a naturalistic framework. On a naturalistic framework, it is extremely surprising that when you combine matter in various ways, so that, you have things in the brain that move according to these simple physical systems that in theory could be, what the brain is doing could be done in principle with water and pipes. But suddenly we become conscious. We have this world of our private qualitative experiences that can't be communicated, that can't be expressed in the language of physics. That's not about the structures of things like physics, but that's about what it's like. I think this is very strange on a naturalistic framework. It's not what you would expect. It is what you would expect if you believe in God, because God would want to give rise to creatures that, the entire reason for God to create a universe is to give rise to creatures that are conscious and capable of having valuable experiences. Then, even after you have consciousness, theism predicts with higher probability that, so even once you have there being certain physical arrangements like brains, that when you have them, you get consciousness. Theism predicts with higher probability that you'd have those physical arrangements at all. On naturalism, maybe brains would give rise to consciousness, but just no brains would ever arise, and that's perfectly probable. So it's a weird coincidence that both you get, on naturalism, the things that give rise to consciousness, there are certain things that give rise to consciousness, and those things happen to arise. And then finally, in terms of the point about consciousness, it's very unlikely that you would get complex or interesting consciousness of any sort. The simplest consciousness involving laws would just involve very valueless consciousness. For example, maybe just every time there's a brain that has any information in it, there's just an experience of seeing red proportional to the amount of information. That would be much simpler than the correlations that we observe, and yet that wouldn't produce any interesting conscious states. So theism predicts that there would be these nice, rich correlations where our mind interacts with our body, and it produces all sorts of mental states. Now, I know you're thinking evolution solves this problem, but evolution doesn't solve the problem. And to be clear, I believe in evolution, but I'm saying it doesn't explain why there's psychophysical harmony. And the reason evolution doesn't solve this problem is that the puzzle is about the correlation between our mind and body, and evolution only cares about the way that we behave. It only cares about the effect on our body. So to see this, every time we have a mental state, there are three things that happen. First, there's some physical state. Let's call it physical state A. So it'll be some state of the brain. Then there's some mental state. Let's call it mental state B, which is some mental state. And then that gives rise to physical state C, which is, for example, a physical movement. So there's the brain state, state A, that gives rise to the thought, hey, I'd like to move my arm, and then I move my arm. That's the third physical state. That's physical state C. But the point is, you could switch out mental state B with any of an infinite number of mental states. You could switch it out with D or E or F or G or H or F prime, any of an infinite number of mental states. And as long as we behave the same way, evolution doesn't care. And so it is surprising that there is a correlation between the things that give rise to consciousness that leads to evolutionary behavior that passes on our genes. It's extremely surprising that those things happen to produce interesting and valuable states of consciousness, when it would be way more probable and a lot simpler for them not to produce any interesting states of consciousness. Next, I think, and I'm not going to go through the entire case because there's a lot that's part of the case, and I think there are a lot of things that just are a little bit of evidence, but they really pile up. But let me just name two more things. One of them is we have the capacity to know right from wrong. Now, morality, rightness and wrongness aren't the types of things that pull around the atoms in our brain. The fact that torture is wrong, that doesn't move around atoms. So on a naturalistic framework, if you think that our beliefs come from the atoms in our brain, it's very unlikely that the atoms in our brain would happen to give us true moral beliefs. So I think naturalism, while it's compatible with the existence of objective morality, it makes it so that it's much less likely that we would know that morality is real. And the same thing applies to mathematics and modal claims, like the fact that Mary bachelors are impossible, claims about what's possible and necessary. And it also applies to claims like worlds that are simpler are more likely. Well, on naturalism, we would have the same beliefs about simplicity because they're selected for about evolution, whether or not they were true. So even if a world where the sun rose tomorrow was no more likely than a world where the sun didn't, we would still have the same beliefs. So we have no justification for thinking, I think, on naturalism that the sun will rise tomorrow. If you want to read more about this, Dustin Crummett and Philip Swenson have a paper called something like The Moral Knowledge Argument, where they advance this in more detail, which I'll try to remember to link below. But it's getting to be a lot of videos to link below, so maybe I'll probably forget some. Okay, and then the last point, and this point it's hard to get your head around. I'll link below a long article, again if I remember, I'll link below a long article where I make the case. But I think it's a powerful consideration. And the idea is that, so it starts from the idea that you exist. Seems right. I agree, you exist. And then the idea is that your existing is more likely if there are more people. So imagine a coin gets flipped, and if it comes up heads, one person gets created, and if it comes up tails, 10 people get created. I claim if you get created, you should think tails is 10 times likelier than heads. A theory that predicts that there are n times more people than another theory confirms your existence by a factor of n times. Now, this idea, it's not intuitive, but I think it's supported by really powerful arguments. I have a published paper where I give a series of arguments for this view, and I think it's very compelling. I unfortunately don't have time to go into the details about all of it. I mean, I guess I could, but I don't want to make this video too long. And this is intended to just be a brief overview. It's gotten longer than I wanted. Yeah, right. So I think I think that, so from the fact that you exist, you get evidence there are more people. Well then, okay, from that, if this is right, you should think there are infinite people. If there are infinite people, it's infinitely likelier that you would exist than if there are finite people. And in fact, there are bigger and smaller infinites, right? So you should think that probably the number of people is the biggest infinite, is the infinite that corresponds to the number of possible people. Well, it turns out that for some technical mathematical reasons, the number of possible people is what's called Beth2. So the smallest infinity is Beth0, then Beth1 is bigger than that, Beth2 is bigger than that. So Beth2, it's more than the number of numbers. It's more than the number of natural numbers, or even real numbers, which are like all the numbers including infinite non-repeating decimals. So I claim if God existed, he would be likely to make Beth2 people, because he would want to make as many people as he could and give them happy lives. And there are Beth2 people who he could give happy lives to. But in contrast, on atheism, it's really unlikely that there would be Beth2 people. Virtually no theories that atheists have ever proposed have led to the existence of Beth2 people. There's not a plausible story of how you even get Beth2 people on atheism. I think you can show, and I again won't go into details, but if a theory on atheism says there are Beth2 people, it probably undermines induction, probably means that you shouldn't think that the sun will rise tomorrow. So for that reason, I think from the fact that you exist, you get infinite evidence that there are uncountably infinite people, and then from the fact that there are uncountably infinite people, you get infinitely strong, or not infinitely strong, but you get very strong evidence that God exists, because God would create a lot more people than atheism and would be more likely to create every possible person, or at least the same cardinality of infinity as the number of possible people. So again, that's not all the evidence for theism. I wrote about a 10,000 word article that one I will link below. I think I won't forget that one. But I think that's sort of a basic overview of the case, and hopefully that gave you a basic sense that the case isn't completely crap. Of course, whenever I post videos like this, the YouTube comments are all like people being very adamant and confused. So maybe it'll be that. But anyways, I guess thanks for watching. Have a good rest of your day. All right, bye.